Welcome. I am Christopher Miller, Senior Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, home of the only permanent exhibit on modern day enslavement, Invisible Today. I'm joined here today with Philip Langford, who serves as President of the International Justice Mission, IJM, United States, leading the teams responsible for IJM's constituent, government, and institutional partnerships. He drives the core strategies and engagements that fuel IJM's growth around the globe. Joining IJM in 2006, Philip has led IJM field programs in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South Asia to strengthen justice systems to protect the poor from slavery and human trafficking, gender-based violence, and police abuse of power. Uh, meaningful work. Thank you for joining us here today, Philip, for this brief conversation that we are having today. And so my first question I would like to ask is, how do you define slavery today?
Yeah, we're not talking about a metaphor here. The word slavery, I think, conjures up for us great horror, great violence, and that's precisely what it is. It is nothing short of taking away someone's freedom so that they can be exploited for profit, and the dominion over another person as property exercised through violence, threats of violence, and often, as we encountered around the world, using the instruments of otherwise legitimate instruments of law enforcement and government power to enforce it. I think the biggest difference for those of us in this country as we think about it is, I think we're used to picturing, as we picture slavery historically, people being abducted, chained, and then brought to a place and then put in conditions of slavery. And that certainly does happen today. We're talking about sex trafficking. We're talking about forced marriage, and the largest form of slavery around the world is forced labor slavery. But so much of the slavery today is less about abduction as the way into the house of slavery, and often debt scams. Traffickers, slave owners preying upon the most vulnerable, who are making impossible decisions for themselves and their families, lured into slavery through the offer of an advance to meet some critical need. But then once they're in, that's just the bait, that's the lure into slavery. And now you're no longer free to go, and they will hunt you down if you try to escape.
So for those that may not be familiar with IJM, can you unpack the work that you do and your colleagues there at IJM?
Happy to. Yeah, thanks for asking, Chris. Our work simply is to protect people in poverty from violence, from slavery, human trafficking, and other forms of violence against women and children, by partnering with governments to end impunity for the slavers, for the traffickers, for the predators, and to provide survivor services that allow survivors of this violence to actually recover their lives in safety and thriving. I say partnering with governments to end impunity because when we're talking about these crimes, when we're talking about slavery, there's almost no place on earth that it's not illegal. That's actually been one of the greatest developments over the last several decades is just about everywhere where slavery exists, it's against the law. It's a crime. But the problem is most of the world's slavery victims today live in countries where there's not even modestly effective law enforcement response. There are laws, but there's not law enforcement. And so I'm talking about no proactive investigation to find and identify victims, no arrests, no prosecutions. There's no restraint. And so what you really have are slave owners and traffickers who are looking at zero risk of actually being caught. Profits are high, risk is low, and then in the poorest parts of the world, a seemingly endless supply of vulnerable people for them to prey on in an environment of total impunity. And so what the good news about this is what we found over the years, and I think this is key to the abolition movement going forward to understand, is what we found is slavery and human trafficking are actually highly responsive to even modest improvements in law enforcement in the places where it exists in largest scale. Can I give you an example of what I'm talking about, Chris?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we work on slavery and trafficking in a number of countries in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia. But to give you a sense of where we first tested this theory that slavery and trafficking rates would crumble if we could bring improvements to law enforcement, we took on this project called Project Lantern. Back in the 2000s, we started working in the Philippines. Little children, teenage girls especially, sold for sex, storefront, out in the open. Police were literally part of the criminal business enterprise, protecting the traffickers. We took on this project. It was actually funded by the Gates Foundation. And what we endeavored to do was test, what if we could actually, could we, number one, improve the police's will and performance to actually respond to this crime? And if we did, would we see reductions in trafficking rates? And so we set this what we thought was an ambitious goal to see trafficking of those minor girls for sex reduced by 20%. What we then did is we began to work shoulder to shoulder with the police on case after case, hitting brothel after brothel after brothel with them, training, equipping them, standing up dedicated anti-trafficking units, building capacity in police, prosecutors, social services, and went for 4 years hard, bringing criminal investigation that actually had not existed, prosecutions, arrests, restraint. And then we measured again after 4 years. We hoped we would see a 20% reduction. We saw a 79% reduction in the number of girls being trafficked for sex in that area. And that model's actually been replicated that was in Cebu City, replicated in Manila, replicated again in another major trafficking hotspot there. Similar results, around 80% reduction, sometimes 85, 86% reductions. And so the name of the game, I think, today, where most of slavery, we find most of the slavery, is actually to help countries that are struggling with it get to the place where they can raise the stakes higher for the traffickers.
You're talking about law and policy, which there's a legacy of that enslavement that is connected to chattel slavery.
Yes.
That occurred here in the States during the 19th century. And so, our mission here are to reveal stories,
Yes.
stories of freedom. So is there a particular story that you can highlight that has impacted you, that continues to inspire you and motivate you to continue to do this work?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many. When I've got my start working on this in the field in South Asia, back in 2006, I'll never. It was the second case that I was working on. At that time, there was no proactive by Indian law enforcement, no proactive investigation really to speak of, and to find victims of labor trafficking or otherwise. And so we had gathered information about brutal conditions in a rice mill. We had very solid evidence of brutal conditions, witness statements, confessions from actually the owner about how the owner enforced its slave labor system in this rice mill. And by the way, this rice mill was not a clandestine enterprise. This was not far from government installations, law enforcement. There just was not the priority or the capability to move on it. It wasn't well understood. And so we brought we brought that evidence, and it was pretty brutal evidence about what was going on in this facility, the violence, the torture, and we described it to this official, and God bless him. I mean, the guy had so many priorities, challenges he's working on in his jurisdiction, and he didn't need another one, and didn't want to go, and thought in some ways, had some, I think, some presuppositions about these people that were enslaved there, and if we rescued them, they would just take another advance, and they'd find themselves back into bondage. Like, it's just a waste of time. And so we said, yes, sir, we understand, but maybe you're right, but would you just please come see for yourself? We don't have the authority to go in there, and we have to go with government. They're our partners. Our mission is for their mission to succeed. And I'll never forget walking in with that official that day. And we came across, and I wished I could show you the picture. I've got it somewhere on my phone. But if this dear man, elderly man named Jayabal, in a crumpled heap behind a barbed wire enclosure, and he sees us coming, he recognizes some of our people, and he sees it's a government law enforcement agent, and he begins to plead with this official and with us to please rescue. And he begins to tell us how the owner, when he's too sick to work, when he doesn't meet his quota, or is he just otherwise angry, would torture him and take about an 8-inch long sewing needle, one of his tools of trade, used to sew up rice bags once they were ready for shipment, would stab him in the groin and in the legs over and over and over again, to make clear his dominion over this man, to punish him. And Jayabal is there pleading with this man for rescue. And I'll tell you, the thing that this actually crystallized for me, the kind of the heart of what we have to do in this movement is we have to actually empower a new way of seeing. Because when this man came face to face with Jayabal, this official's not a bad person. Came face to face with another human being suffering under those kinds of conditions. It moved from abstraction to concrete, vivid reality. And now he sees Jayabal, and there's no confusion for him that day about what must be done. He has to get Jayabal and his family and the other families that are trapped there to safety. And that has stuck with me throughout my career at IJM. This is about seeing another human being, and they're knowing their story, their real story, not an abstraction, and the power of that to drive change. So many other stories I could tell you. I mean, I wish I could unpack for you now what we're seeing, Chris, in terms of now, sir, you think about the movement in the United States to end slavery, and survivors of slavery leading, survivors like Frederick Douglass leading, giving voice, telling the story with power and persuasion. We are now seeing this come to bear in the very place where I started, where now survivors are at the forefront of leading this. And this is the way it should be, because they are actually the experts on what these systems are. And we're just really so grateful to be a part of that.
Absolutely, and that's an opportunity to not only uplift them out of the systemic issue that is taking place, but also to empower them. So to uplift and to empower is so important.
Absolutely.
So is there a particular area around the globe that is at rise? Speaking with your colleagues, they cited, possibly the Philippines of being an area to where there's a rise. And so, is there a particular country that you can advise us that really garners a lot of attention to a rise in human trafficking?
Yeah, the pandemic, in all of our work around the world, trafficking and otherwise, we've seen significant surges either in trafficking or in vulnerability, real increases to vulnerability to trafficking as countries have locked down to manage the pandemic. I would highlight two things in the trafficking space to be paying attention to. Think of the millions of migrant workers, workers in the informal sectors in South Asia, Southeast Asia, certainly in India. There were tens of millions upon the government locking down to begin to get control of the pandemic. Tens of millions of informal sector workers within India, migrant workers, now stranded with maybe a half day's ration. It was quite a scene, and of course we know all of these families, their children are very vulnerable to debt scams in those situations. Same in some of the recruiting corridors from, say, Cambodia and Myanmar to Malaysia, Thailand. These are hugely vulnerable populations, and areas that have been marked by massive impunity for traffickers. And so we're seeing surges in vulnerability there. I think my colleague mentioned to you the trends we're seeing in the Philippines. And let me unpack that one a little bit. The focus of our work there is on online sexual exploitation of children. Sometimes we refer to it as cyber sex trafficking. A moment ago, I was telling you about how from around 2000, really from 2000 to about 2015, we had a program in partnership with the Philippines government to tackle street-based, brothel-based sex trafficking of minors. And the transformation that we've seen throughout the country in dismantling that industry is amazing, really remarkable. From police who were part of the criminal business enterprise to now police, and all the way up to the top of those law enforcement agencies committed to owning the security of their children and trying to and going after the traffickers to stop that. But what we began to see, just for a little context, in around 2015, as we were, in a sense, handing that work over entirely to the Philippines government, we began to see a new kind of case, a new kind of crime, this online sexual exploitation of children. What was happening in those days is broadband internet was proliferating around the country. It's cheap, and we were seeing a new type of criminal trafficker, and we were seeing new types of victims. Most of the victims in the street-based, brothel-based stuff were teenagers. And trafficked by business people, establishment owners. In the online stuff, we were seeing children overwhelmingly under the age of 10, many of them toddlers, children, selling to pedophiles around the world, from the US, Netherlands, Australia, Canada, Europe, the ability for anywhere from $25 to $100 to direct the live stream sexual abuse and rape of children. And they got to do this all from the presumed anonymity of their homes behind a laptop. And so the traffickers in the Philippines were often family members and close neighbors. And so all you needed was access to vulnerable children, an internet connection, and a cheap webcam or a smartphone, and you could do this from anywhere, and a way to receive funds. And one of the aspects of the pandemic has been, with more people online for longer, we've seen a surge in demand. We partner with NCMEC and U.S. law enforcement and other country law enforcement on the demand side, who are reporting a massive increases in cyber tips to the Philippines government. And so our work has been to really help the Philippines government get a handle on this new complex crime. It has a demand side, but it is also a for-profit criminal business enterprise in the Philippines. And Philippines, strangely, has become a global epicenter for this crime, Chris. I think it has a lot to do with the availability of internet. English travels very, very well, and of course there are a lot of vulnerable children in poverty there. So big increases there. Wonderfully, we are confronting a very different situation now than when we started 20 years ago. We have a Philippines government that, and community, church, community organizations that are really now awake and alive to these atrocities, and there's quite a strong movement to stop the crime.
Well, I definitely want to thank you, Philip, for sharing. This is the work that you're doing is remarkable with IJM, and definitely want to continue to uh, keep you inspired, stay motivated as the world is dealing with the challenge of this pandemic, and but still this work is needed. Help is required for these individuals. Definitely want to thank you for spending time. Do you have any closing last words that you want to provide for people who will be listening to this virtual talk that we're having?
Listen, I'm so thankful for your work, Chris, and I do think it really does. We can end slavery in our lifetime. We can put it out of business. I think the part of the key is, and I'm so thankful for all who will be tuning in to your work this month, is number one is to see. We've got to draw close, and I do think part of what is required if we're going to love our neighbor well is we've got to draw close and draw close to the pain to understand their story, and not the abstraction. And so and then we actually have to just get laser focused on the key things. There's so many things that you can do in response, but to learn and educate ourselves about those key things, those key levers to pull that would make the biggest difference and the biggest impact. And so anyway, thankful to be in this with you. It's a fight, it's a struggle, but we can end it.
Well, definitely a sincere thank you to you as well. For greater awareness on matters of human trafficking, please visit enslaverynow.org. Please know that End Slavery Now is a project of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Your financial support enables us to continue to educate, inspire, and equip people to help end slavery now. Once again, I want to thank Philip Langford for joining us for this conversation. And please be empowered, be inspired to make a difference in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be with you.